maybe what I'll do is set a bit of the context because I think it's important for the audience to know how Canada, like our history and our context and how we got here. And between Juan and I, we'll sort of talk about like where we are today and what we're seeing that's working. There's still plenty of lessons learned along the way, and we're still learning every day. But we do not have a good history in Canada with Indigenous people, Indigenous communities. I'm not going to give you the whole history lesson. There's lots of literature on that. But even like as recently as 50, 60, 70 years ago, our, like utilities, state-owned utilities would flood out reserve land. These are sort of designated lands for Indigenous communities, would flood them out of their communities and relocate them so that we could create hydroelectricity, as an example. And we would even blast through, spiritual lands and graveyards. That's just a couple of examples of just the horrific sort of history that Canada has with Indigenous communities. And so we have a long way to go to repair that damage. We're far from close to mending that.
In terms of recent development history, there was a Supreme Court ruling in 2005 that really enshrined it. No, if you're going to be doing work in communities' traditional territory, you need to engage with them, and there is a duty to consult with them and accommodate if there are going to be impacts.
I think it helped, but it also created a very transactional process. It was a set of things that government and industry had to do before they could do anything on the land. You have to engage, you must consult, you need to understand the impacts, you need to try and demonstrate how you're mitigating the impact.
A system that really encouraged communities to emphasize impacts and sort of, set up an obstruction sort of dynamic where communities were more encouraged to emphasize the problems that a project brought if they wanted to sort of feel that they were getting meaningful benefits.
It was very industry, government versus Indigenous communities. We're on this side, you're on that side. We have a process we have to follow. We're going to follow it, and then we're going to just do what we're going to do anyway. And I think that created it mounted up opposition. Indigenous communities were saying this doesn't feel meaningful. We're not feeling heard. Something doesn't feel right here. The land continues to be impacted. We're continuing to not experience the benefits. And it just created a lot of issues on the land base, and projects were not getting built. Transmission lines that were absolutely necessary and critical to keeping the lights on were not getting built. There was conflict, tensions in the opposition grew so drastically. It mobilized the country. And I think it was this sort of moment in time where everyone's saying, this is not working. But certainly First Nations gained their voice, that's for sure. And government stepped in big time, and so did industry.
You'd start to see procurements in electricity projects, just speaking from my own experience, where it was mandatory that you get incentives in the beginning, and later mandatory that 10% equity or something like that. And that sort of grew over time. So a lot of procurements today, there's sort of minimum Indigenous equity requirements, and then there's sort of incentives to go higher. And you often see proponents structuring deals with Indigenous communities to go on those higher ends, like a 50% partnership is very common. And in addition to that, what we're also seeing, and we see this in the Wataynikaneyap transmission project that I worked on, where the Indigenous communities are saying, actually, we want to do a project in our area, and we're going to get ourselves together, and we're going to sort of define what we want this project to be. And we're going to take this to a point where, okay, we need industry experts to help us, and we're going to go to the market and talk to different industry players and see who wants to partner with us and become our partner. And so, a bit of a reversal. And so there, whereas I think, traditionally there'd be a mindset where communities were seen as sort of, yeah, they're there, we bring the opportunities, we work with them. This is them sort of saying, hey, we've got the opportunity, and we want you to come work with us. and we're going to sort of shape this how we'd like, and we want to find an industry partner who wants to play with us, and work with us in a way that's acceptable. And so, you can make the argument that it starts to, you have more opportunity to share under when you sort of go down this road, because the communities start to create opportunities that they're bringing to industry.
How does an impoverished community, sometimes living in subsistence economy, become a 50% shareholder in a large-scale renewable energy project or a transmission line, which is also very capital intensive? So some people fear that this requires a handout, that you have to give away like some equity for free, and that will affect your project return rate.
This is, I think, a very tangible place that government has really stepped in, and a space that we're still rely heavily on is government provides either like loans or government backed loans, called like basically guaranteeing a loan. And the bank would be willing to loan the money to the Indigenous community because government is going to guarantee that if something were to happen, that they would be there to basically fill the loan for them. And so there's many programs across Canada, both at the federal government level and at the provincial government level.
Sometimes a proponent will provide an equity loan in the beginning, and then once a project is up and operational and cash flows are sort of demonstrated and stable, it allows the community to go seek its own source of financing based on the track record of the project. So I know some proponents get a little bit scared about putting out equity to support a partner like that, but it can be a case where it may be, just a couple of years, and then you go together to whatever entity is available to sort of take the developer's share out and replace that with their own financing.
Banks like that, I think, are getting more and more comfortable loaning directly to First Nations. We're not totally there yet. I think they still want to see that the First Nation has some wealth, some collateral, so that in the event there's a default, the bank is in a comfortable position to still loan in those circumstances.
It's really helpful to have when a community forms its own economic development corporation that reports to some sort of democratically elected leadership, but is separate from the politics, so that when there's a change in leadership or whatever, there's an entity that's stable and stays there and is sort of at arm's length.
We've heard Indigenous people say, our way of making decisions is probably slower and it takes time. So if you want to develop a project with us, you have to understand that we take time. On the other hand, for corporations, time is essentially money. And so the faster you move, the better. So how do you reconcile these two ways of looking at time?
You cannot rush projects through. I think too, if I reflect back on 20 years ago, industry would bring a fully defined project to First Nation communities to say, what do you think about this? And there's almost no opportunity for them to provide feedback on a project. And it doesn't work. The industries now doesn't want to change the project design because they've already spent so much money investing in the design and the engineering and all that goes into a project. They're reluctant to make those changes. And the First Nations is saying, well, why are you even bringing this to me if you're not willing to make some of these changes to the project? And so you get to a bit of like a stalemate, a standstill, right? Now, when like we develop big wind projects, for example, and now we go to one of our very first stops is to the First Nations, Indigenous communities, and say, hey, there's a good wind in your territory, in your backyard. If we were to build a wind project here, would you be supportive of something like that? And if they go, sometimes they say, absolutely, yes, let's work together on, on the details. Or some might say, yes, but stay away from this area because it's culturally significant to us. And think about the value of that to a private sector who just saved themselves millions of dollars, investigating an area that would have been a non-starter. Not only does it give you a bit more certainty on where you want to do your project, it is building trust in that relationship. And that is worth so much value along the way. And then on the economic partnership side of things, like this private sector, we're used to like hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and that's something that's simple for us to wrap our head around. Some of the Indigenous communities, that level of investment is not something they've ever even experienced. And so you need to help them understand, how are we reducing risk for you financially? How are we structuring this project together? Even show them a month to month or year over year cycle to say, this is when we're going to need a capital injection. This is when we're going to need to repay certain debts. And this is then what you're going to get at the end of the day. You're probably used to like keeping your cards tight and like, oh, but that's like really commercially sensitive information. I don't really want to share that, but it's like, you got to.
It is pretty normal to hire, as a proponent, to pay for a financial advisor for the community. You usually come as a proponent, say, hey, listen, I've got this project. I know this is going to add a lot to your workload. I'm also bringing resources to help you engage with this project.
What adjustments do large energy companies need to make to understand that now you're sitting at the table and sharing decision-making with First Nations?
I think that's probably the toughest part, if I have to say, for industry is relinquishing or giving up some sense of control. And in reality, once you get down to it, they don't want to get into the business. They just want to make sure that the investment that they're putting into it, they have say, and they have voting rights on like the big financially material decisions.
In the case where the Indigenous communities got together and started their own project, on Wataynikaneyap transmission project, 1,800 kilometers of transmission line in their territory, that was very different. They wanted a lot of governments, and a big learning process. I think we're early stages in Canada on projects that are using that model. I've seen a few companies or communities where they've done, say, a wind farm 5-10 years ago, and now they're taking a more active role in the next one, and maybe a more active role in the next one, and they, that kind of thing. Or a company was in their territory, left, and the community's like, we'll actually pick this project up, and we want a first right of refusal if you leave, to step in and kind of do it ourselves to a certain point. So that's kind of the evolution we're seeing.
We really need them to be owners with us because it makes the business work. It gives the business longevity and certainty. It removes risk. We're all motivated to succeed. And so I'm just conscious of there's a lot of layering on of what industry is doing, but it's because we're so bought into this reality that it works and it makes sense and it's the only opportunity for growth in Canada.